Dear participants, today we will discuss the key migration policies and trends to watch in 2021, focusing on the EU and its neighbourhood. Building on the main lessons from 2020, we will look at the various possible implications of COVID-19 on migration and mobility. We try to sketch out the new normal following the eventual recovery from the ongoing emergency, and we look at the internal and external dimensions of the European Pact, Migration and Asylum. We will also look at megatrends such as climate change and digitalisation and the possible impact of the US elections on global migration management. Let me start by inviting our two panelists to take a short look back at 2020. For sure, an extraordinary year. What lessons can we draw from 2020 and what is relevant for 2021 and beyond? What is the impact of the corona crisis and what will be the echo of this ongoing crisis? What will be the legacy of Trump and will we be able to return to full-fledged multilateralism? Jean-Louis, if I could invite you to maybe share your first thoughts on this.
Thank you very much, Martijn, and thank you very much also for ICMPD for having invited me. I mean, I have a long memory of collaboration with ICMPD since the very early days, the creation of this organization by Ambassador Jonas Widgren. And I'm really happy to see how much it has grown and how efficient a partner it is now, not only for its member states, but also for the EU and EU institutions. Well, indeed, I mean, your question is the million-dollar question. Although we are already in 2021, I think that it's still too soon to draw lessons or conclusions from what happened in 2020. It is also, I must say, I would not recommend either, by the way, to engage into forecasts about what the future is going to be. What we can draw today, what we can do today is to draw scenarios, some of them more plausible than others, and then see how they actually develop. One thing is for sure is that since the beginning of 2020, since spring 2020, we understand now better what mobility meant, because we are not mobile anymore. We are stuck. And we could remain stuck for still sometimes in 2021. Mobility is, of course, a much broader concept than migration. Migration is a form of mobility. But the basis statement, the basic is that we are now stuck. Borders, whether borders are closed or not, the good old days where we were jumping into planes, taking train, are over. It creates new situation. Should we have had this conversation 1.5 years ago, I would most probably have had the privilege to travel to beautiful Vienna, and we would have sit together in the same room. Over, but we move to new forms of communication. So it's a crisis in the full sense of the word. That is to say, it's a turning point, but we don't know where we are going to, which means that we have a crisis now in front of us. It has, of course, implication on, I would say, our classical concept of migration. Migration, immigration, asylum, all that is now impacted by the crisis. I mean, there is no sanctuary. Where does that lead us to? Difficult to say. Some said, if we go back to the EU agenda before thinking global, in a way it could help, because political priorities are elsewhere. Political pressure is focusing on more important and different issues, health, economic recovery. Then therefore it opens a space for a quiet, documented conversation about the future of the EU immigration policy. We are beyond the crisis mode. Maybe, but that will come later in our conversation, and we'll have also together together with our colleagues in the audience, to try to assess where we are on that count for the time being. At global level, again, I mean, what will happen? We're going to have to discuss later today our relations with third countries of origin and transit, to use the classical concepts which are still found in many official papers about migration. But before entering into a dialogue with third countries on migration and mobility, the first and foremost priority is the V priority, vaccination. Because, I mean, what is the world, what could the world of tomorrow look like? Someone used this concept and I like it a lot, a series of mobility bubbles. We have also these kind of mobility bubbles inside the EU today with the extra red zone, the red zone. Everybody is either extra red or red. There is no green or orange zone for the time being, but they might soon be green or orange zone if all the very optimistic views about the impact of vaccination do materialize. What will that imply? But moreover, I mean, if you look at the planet as such, that's going to be the situation tomorrow. When shall we be able to travel again to the United States? When shall we be able to travel again to Latin America and vice versa, and under which condition? All that will be, I would say, the overall landscape of, I mean, the migration, the approach of migration flows. Last but not least, you hinted at the new American administration. It is very obvious that when you look at the list of decrees that were taken by Joe Biden in the immediate aftermath of his investiture, some of them are migration related. I mean, he had made promise concerning the future of the Dreamers, and he did materialize its promise. What does that mean in terms of, I would say, multilateralism? Clearly, the Biden administration will re-engage in multilateralism. I think that everybody is aware that there are fantastic opportunities, that we can look at a revamped EU-US transatlantic partnership that maybe, I mean, there was a conversation between Mr. Putin and Mr. Biden. I mean, all that is on the horizon. I mean, is it about lip service or is it about something more profound? There will always be divergences. There will always be divergences, but at least the way of handling things by the new administration opens spaces for new conversation. I mean, will IOM, WHO has already benefited from this new approach. Will IOM and the Global Compact benefit from it? To be seen. Will UNRWA benefit of it? To be seen. But these are, again, I come back to what I said earlier and I stop there. It's about scenarios. We don't know as of today how it will unfold. Our responsibility is to sketch different possibilities and then try to steer the decision-making process so that we might move, if everything develops as expected, as hoped, we might move in, I would say, towards the most profitable solution or the less damageable. I would stop there.
Thank you, Jean-Louis. As always, a very rich point, and we will come back to some of them in a bit more detail later on in our conversation. Ralph, what are your main takeaways for 2020? What can you add to what Jean-Louis already said?
Well, thank you very much, Martijn, and thank you very much, first and foremost, to my colleagues from the Prague process for organizing this, and to Jean-Louis for doing this virtual discussion, and of course to everybody. I see we have quite a large number of attendees, which is great to see. Because I think the one thing we can definitely do, and what we have to do, and the discussion has to continue. We have been discussing a lot last year, observing, analyzing, and well, as Jean-Louis pointed out, when we want to look ahead, it's about scenarios, and we need the different points of views to refine scenarios and work on them. Now, to everything what Jean-Louis already mentioned, I think for me, when I sort of observe Europe, or observed Europe last year, I mean, I always like to look at the reality, and I think that's also sort of for ICMPD. I think we are a very pragmatic organization. We look at, you know, what are the realities out there. I think the COVID-19 situation just showed so strikingly clear certain realities which I mean, sometimes we don't want to see, we don't want to recognize, we take for granted. You know, the impression is we don't have to deal with it. I think what was already mentioned and what is about migration and mobility in the EU, it's of course sort of, you know, Schengen borders, and it just showed so strongly the reality of borders, that whether we have borders, we don't have borders, even when you don't have the physical border, you still have a border, because we are, and that's the other reality, and we often regret, I mean, some regret it in the EU, you know, looking at the realities in Europe. And one reality is this notion of borders. And even in the absence of a physical border, we have borders, we have state boundaries, we still have, you know, the 27 member states of the EU. And so this, you know, do we have borders, absence of borders, how do we manage that, is something which will accompany us in the EU for many, many years. And I think that is important. And I think the other also link there is sort of, again, another reality in the EU is just very simply the different geographies. I find it is still striking to look at the EU from the Baltics to the Mediterranean, with, again, borders, sea borders, land borders, certain borders where we have, I mean, trans-border traffic on a daily basis, which you don't feel anymore that you are in different countries, because, you know, you do your shopping on the other side of what is meant to be the border. And with the pandemic, we saw that in March in the beginning, you know, there was, I mean, the first approach was to really cut it down. Nothing. But then, of course, I mean, we have seen that, and there's lots of discussion. I think that's not so new. I mean, how, you know, the impact, and we want to see that, I mean, that trade flows can happen and so on. That this is happening. But these realities, I think, are important. And linked to that as well, another, I think we will come back to this as well. We speak a lot about technology. We take it for granted. It's somewhere out there. But again, with the pandemic and well, I think it's everyday's life, it is so striking the role of technology. And clearly, as Jean-Louis said, you know, it will have such an impact on migration and mobility, and how we try to manage it, how we want to find solutions. And the final, again, the notion of reality. I mean, even before, when we looked at the totally, I mean, the different aspect of our societies are inequality. I think the inequalities are also even before in the EU, but broader in the world. I mean, very present. You can look at that in all sorts of studies with regard to even poverty levels within the EU. But here, the impact of the pandemic actually on inequalities. And I think from there, when we go then into, you know, access to health services, access to vaccination and so on, again, that will impact actually scenarios for the future. I'll leave it here for the moment.
Thank you, Ralph. I mean, indeed, points that we will have to look at very carefully, especially, you know, what will technology do, border management, and the inequalities. I'll come back to that a bit later. Ralph, to stay with you, 2020 also saw the long-awaited publication of the EU Migration Pact. Maybe just for our audience, what are the key, let's say, innovative new elements of the pact? Where did we see what type of progress? And maybe you can share a few points about the talent partnerships. Ralph, please.
Well, thank you. Yes, I mean, but I think to start with, I think you have to, and I guess in our audience, there are many migration practitioners, analysts, and so on. I mean, you have to be a migration practitioner or interested in migration issues to remember, I guess, the pact when you look back on 2020. I think I think the big discussion last year, I mean, now we take it as being over, was certainly the discussion about the recovery fund, I mean, the new EU budget, I mean, massive amounts which the EU member states and I mean, the institutions, they will mobilize for the recovery from for the pandemic. I think that's important still as the broader framework to mention, because then the pact fits as one policy measure into this broader framework. And we saw it that the pact only came then out in September, because somehow it was felt that it was never the right moment, which shows already that the sensitivity, even with pandemic and other issues sort of seen as being more important, the sensitivity of the topic within the EU is certainly not over. Now, I think when the pact was out, the reactions and the atmosphere around among member states and reactions towards the European Commission, I think were positive. It was welcomed as a basis for discussion. And the Commission said always, the Commissioner Johansson especially, that there was a lot of exercise, a lot of discussions with member states, and to listen to them and to see how a new start could be achieved. Now, I think I will come to that in more detail. I mean, where we stand with the pact and what to hope for. Now, the pact is, and I think we should really look at the pact at all parts of the pact. I mean, we have the legislative part, where clearly, I mean, the heart is this whole discussion about solidarity and responsibility. And then we have, I think there are about 5 proposals for legislation with certain new elements. We have a certain number of recommendations, which sound very loose and policy measures, but still they will set the agenda for the next years and put certain issues on the agenda, which will come. And not to forget then also that there are still certain elements of legislation which are still out there, waiting to be adopted ideally at some point. For instance, the new mandate for the EU agency in Malta for the Asylum Support Office to have a broader mandate, which is, I would say, an important one. Now, new notions, I think on the side of legislation, I think clearly, I mean, is it so new, but it's very strong emphasis that, with the role of the external border, and especially what is called the screening regulation, the hope that more could be done, let's put it that way, at the external border, linked then to other parts of legislation with return procedures and so on. That is certainly this emphasis, I would say, is certainly new. And here we are already at the heart of this whole responsibility, solidarity. With regard to solidarity, clearly, again, I would call it a reinforced emphasis that there are various ways to show solidarity. It's mandatory, but various ways of solidarity exist. So I'll leave it here on that. Plus then other new elements, a strong emphasis on crisis preparedness. I find that very positive because that is really lessons learned from 2015. To have the EU institutions and stakeholders working together, and that goes into the direction of forecasting. That's a new element. Return, very strong there. Again, that is continuation, but to institutionalize, let's say, return also through a return coordinator. And then you asked, especially with regard to what are called now talent partnerships. I mean, I think that's probably the new notion when it comes to the external cooperation part, the cooperation with partner countries. An emphasis that also, the area of legal migration, skills, talent, as we often speak now about, has to be part of an agenda of external cooperation. And that fits, I think, also a broader policy agenda of the European Commission, and that is announced for this year, that more is to come in the area of skills and talent, actually. But I think that emphasis, again, it's not legislative, it's setting the policy agenda. And I think that is also important, and we shouldn't forget about these elements, when we look at all parts of the pact, which we often reduce only to the two notions of responsibility and solidarity. Certainly at the heart of it and at the heart of the discussion and having the potential to block actually progress. I think we have to put it that way. But the other elements are all certainly there where we might see actually progress this year or the years to come.
Yeah. Thank you, Ralph. Jean-Louis, as someone who has been following the migration file at least since the early 90s and has been very closely part of shaping the way the present migration acquis looks like. If you look at the pact, where do you see, let's say, the main front lines, the key elements where agreement will be difficult to reach, and where are you most hopeful? Where do you see, okay, this is something where we can expect progress on the European side?
I would maybe pick up on a few things that Ralph said to stress how important they are. I did not expect to disagree with you, Ralph, anyway, but I'm really on the same line as you. First, a reference to the notion of borders. I remember vividly the debates during the first weeks which followed the lockdown. Most specialists, epidemiologists, were of the view that closing borders had no impact whatsoever on the pandemic, because anyway, the decision to close border is always taken too late, once the virus is already in there. I mean, look at the situation in Belgium today. I mean, we are under a travel ban until the end of the month of February, but nowadays it appears already that the so-called British variant of the virus is dominant in this country. So it does not serve any purpose. It's too late. But at that time, Margaritis Schinas said something very important. He said, now look, at the time we asked people to lock them down, it would have been totally counterintuitive to leave border open. And I think that there is a lot in the way this was approached. We'll elaborate further during our conversation about the future of borders and the impact, for instance, of the use of new technologies and how borders will be managed. But I mean, there is a symbol there which came back very forcefully, and that's where I totally agree with you. Now, there is a risk. I mentioned earlier the importance of scenarios, is that indeed, when you look at the way people do live for the time being, they used to praise a lot the free circulation. Now they are getting familiar with the situation, or where after all, we can live without Schengen, or we can live without part of Schengen. I mean, as long as the so-called green lines remain open for treks. The second thing on which I agree totally with you, Ralph, is about the timing of the presentation of the pact. Yes, indeed, it was essential that the Commission wait until there was this kind of Hamiltonian moment, as it was called in July, around the EU new generation, recovery strategy, with this new form of solidarity, so that, I mean, there could be at least a window of opportunity to table a proposal which was indeed, again, building upon the notion of solidarity. Now, where does that lead us to? First of all, I really have to make a very important precautionary statement there, because I mean, I've been involved from time to time in discussion, public discussion about the pact, and sometimes I end up listening to myself as utterly, critical with regards to the Commission. And I don't want that, because, okay, I've been a Commission official for such a long time. I bear a responsibility, as you said very rightly, Martijn, in the way the immigration policy has shaped. And I don't want to be seen as someone who has now retired and take a distance from this institution and what it has been doing. I mean, I have sometimes the feeling that this game for the Commission is a lose-lose game. I always remember a former president of the European Council, my compatriot, Mr. Van Rompuy, saying that of all issues on the EU agenda, immigration is the only one where a Franco-German agreement cannot make a European deal. So, I mean, it's an utterly complicated situation the Commission has to deal with. She actually, the institution, sorry, made a complete U-turn in its methodology. And you were right also, Ralph. When it tabled its post-crisis proposal in 2015 and 2016, it was stonewalled because it was blamed for not having listened to the warnings the member states were saying before coming with the systems of mandatory solidarity. And the Commission was stonewalled, and we got stuck. Margrethe Schinas and Ylva Johansson took a completely different approach, and indeed, as you said, they at length consulted member states, doing how many tours de capital, physical or virtual, to prepare that proposal. The problem is that they end up with something which is difficult to understand and most probably not operational. They achieved what they wanted. They wanted this, as you said rightly, have to be seen as a good basis for discussion. And it is exactly the wording of the handover report of the German presidency, but not more than that. Not more than that. Will that lead us somewhere? I belong to the skepticals. I mean, as far as the core issue is concerned, I mean, leaving aside the fact that there were some communication mistakes made by the Commission, for instance, stating that Dublin was dead. No, please, Dublin is not dead. Dublin is still there and alive and well. And that's part of the problem, of course. I mean, is there a way out? I doubt. Listening to the German presidency, I mean, the farewell speech of the German officials and the German minister, they said very rightly, no, look, we could hardly have achieved anything more. We had only 2 months of negotiation and 2 months of virtual meeting. You cannot achieve any political deal in these kind of circumstances. I remember Minister Seehofer expressing the hope that the November Justice and Home Affairs Council would have been a meeting in person, where you could have had this kind of personal chemistry, which led to an agreement on the big recovery package at the European Council in July. They were not offered that. And I think that the Portuguese presidency will start under the same auspices and the same difficult circumstances. So I'm not hopeful about the possibility to, get something out of the core of the business of the pact. All the more, and we'll come back on that, and I come back to what you said about borders, Ralph, that there might be a major game changer halfway through the semester of the Portuguese presidency, and it is the Schengen package, which is announced by the Commission. I mean, I was amongst those who were of the view that it was impossible to delink the responsibility versus solidarity issue from a deep look at how Schengen works and what Schengen means. So that's the reason why I was a little bit taken aback when I saw that the Commission was dissociating the two. Okay, it did so, and they must have had very good reasons. But now Schengen is back, and that might not necessarily make the life of everybody easier. Some might say, yes, but it will open the space for the conversation and it will open the space for the negotiation. Yes, it might offer the possibility of new trade-offs, but it might also make the things much more difficult. Now, last comment of mine, sorry if I'm a bit long, but again, I would follow up what you said, Ralph. Of course, there are many other migration-related issues that could be usefully tackled. And for instance, indeed, I think that there is a very forward-looking crisis management scenario, which is put forward or proposed by the Commission in the migration package. But this has not been even opened yet. I mean, it's there. And what I hear from insider, I'm not an insider into the negotiation, is that the kind of package approach that you say there is an agreement on nothing, as in there is no agreement on everything, will remain and will, at least for some time, prevent what you expect, what I expect, what others expect, that is at least some of the files where there is already an agreement ready on the table could be unlocked. Last but not least, and it is also very clear in the report of the German presidency, okay, it is about EU legislation, it is about EU framework, but God's sake, it is also about member states' practices. It is about the way member states do implement, I mean, common legislation, do make use of the instruments which are made at their disposal. And there again, I come back to what I said earlier, praising ICMPD. This is an area where the pragmatic, to quote you, Ralph, ICMPD can have a role to play. I mean, it could work significantly better if at least member states were, to use a quite familiar expression, were putting their money where their mouth was when they adopted the legislation and the policy framework. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Jean-Louis. I hope we have some time to come back to some of the points you raised later. If you have time, there's a lot of things that I still want to discuss, especially the last point you raised, that there is maybe, you know, there have been practices in the past where groups of member states started working among themselves on a certain topic, and that later then grew into, you know, common European practices and actually became then standard European practice and policy even. Now, Jean-Louis, to stay shortly with you, there's two other very important developments and priorities of the present Commission, and they also touch, of course, and have an impact on migration, namely digitalisation and climate change-induced mobility. Which trends do you observe here, and with regard to climate change and related forced migration, what responsibilities does Europe have, and what, with regard to digitalisation, what impact does digitalisation have on migration and or on migration management? Where do you see the big trends here?
Let's start with digitalization. I mean, it's there already. I mean, the 20th century or the 21st century migration is driven by technologies. Let me take two examples. I mean, when you hear the history of the so-called irregular migrants, their journey to Europe has been made possible thanks to the use of GSM communication. I mean, they tell you that they hardly meet their smugglers, that they are in touch with them through this, telecommunication means, that they are told to go from one point to another, when they are taken, between quote, care of by people they don't know and they will not never see anymore. And I mean, this, kind of a technological support makes their journey possible. It's the backbone, the technological backbone of their journey. Integration policies. I am of the view that we have to factor into integration policies the mere fact that third country nationals, having moved sometimes thousands of kilometers away from their communities and countries of origins, have all possible means to remain in touch with their community of origin, with their family, with their culture. I mean, they have internet, they have GSM, they have, and okay, I mean, this, I think, should be factored into the way we approach the debate about the integration model. How the relation between migrant communities or communities of migrant origin and receiving communities should be organized. So digitalization is still there. I mean, new technologies are there. There is nothing new under the sun. Now, the question is, how should they be used in the future when it is about dealing migration? Again, what I see shaping on the EU agenda is a control-oriented approach. When I look at the package announced by the Commission, including the so-called Schengen package, I see that one of the 4 proposals will be about digitalization of visa procedure. A move which I welcome, by the way, a move which I welcome. And we all know also about the ongoing work on interoperability. And I mean, this kind of a common platform that should be created. So, I mean, we see that we move towards a control-oriented approach and the use of new technologies to promote a control-oriented approach. Is that the only way to factor them in? I don't know. Let me add, before moving to climate change, one last comment. It's about the impact of artificial intelligence. We are only at the beginning of this. I would limit myself to say that there is a red line, and it's a very personal view. I will not pretend that I'm an expert on that. And it's that some decision cannot be made by machine. There have to be a human dimension in the decision-making process. They can be prepared by machine, they can be prepared by algorithms, but at the end of the day, there must be a human assessment of the situation before the decision is taken. It's exactly, I know that I'm comparing Apple and peers, exactly the same discussion as the one about, autonomous, how do you call that? Autonomous lethal weapon. I mean, drones, in other words. So that I think should be factored into the way we are going to approach this issue. Now on the climate change, I would say we have to be very careful in the way we approach this issue and its impact on migration. I think that it has or it will have an impact, but an indirect one. First of all, the bulk of climate-induced displacement are internal displacement before they become migration, if ever they become migration. I see now that the high-level group on IDPs, which was mandated by OCHA, has bring his work to an end, and then there is very soon a webinar when they will present the outcome of their finding. But clearly, the volume of internal displacement should be something we should look at, because it is also closely linked with another structural development very often in so-called countries of origin, which is the massive urbanization of this country. Second dimension, and it's about, how fragile some communities do become because of climate change. I was recently reading a series of studies and reports which all come to the same conclusion. They say that we have no evidence until now of conflicts that would be directly induced by climate change, but they can be aggravated. That is to say that climate change could have, I would say, a negative impact on the humanitarian and the human outcomes of existing conflicts when these conflicts break out among communities which are already made much more fragile because of the deterioration of their environment. So I think that we should approach this issue from these two angles. Of course, I think there is a gain there. We might come back later on what is my obsession these days, i.e. vaccination. But there is, of course, a major issue of solidarity between, I would say, the global north and the global south. And we're going to see more and more at the COP26 this year, if it takes place in Glasgow as foreseen and later on. Who is going to pay the price for, to pay for the investments which are needed to limit the dramatic consequences of climate change? We're going to have to show, between inverted comma, rich, wealthy countries and communities, will have to show some solidarity with those who are not being able to afford, the cost of an efficient fight against climate change. Because if we do not do that, we shall end up in the same kind of cleavages that the one that we have witnessed in the past amongst big global issues like demography, for instance, or simply protection of the environment, where some will say, why should I make an effort to sort out a problem which is first and foremost your problem? And it sounds a little bit like migration-related issue. Over to you.
Thank you, Jean-Louis. Again, a very rich answer with many elements that we can come back to also, hopefully via some of the questions which can be triggered by what you have said. So I would like to remind everyone to add their questions to the chat. Ralph, one development which also already Jean-Louis just raised is artificial intelligence. And for me, what trends do you see we have to watch here? Can it also become a useful tool for migration management? And it was already hinted at by Jean-Louis. What are the ethical concerns that we really need to be careful about? What do we need to address here? Policymakers need to address.
Thank you. I'll come in you. Give me 1 second, because I think also since we are with our partner countries from the Prague process, I think I would like to make the link how partner countries of the European Union look at the European Union also with a description of the situation we have just given. So I think it's I mean, there is a bit of a continuum that partner countries will have to live with the reality of the European Union as we described it, where internally a lot of discussions will be ongoing, not necessarily agreement of some of the most important issues as we pointed out. However, we have agreement that everybody wants to have a strong external dimension of EU migration policy. With an emphasis, and I think that is clear, I think it has to be recalled as well, on return, for instance, with now a starting emphasis, let's put it, on legal migration. I think, and I'll come to that in a second, I think that that is important. But I think that, you know, to deal with this structure which has different interests, which is not always on the same line, I think that is still something to be well, again, to be reminded. Now, also your question about, you know, climate change, or let's say the green economy. I mean, to mention a positive aspect, the digitalization or the technological transformation of our societies and economies. I mean, that is actually the Commission's agenda. That is what the EU wants to engage. And I think there also, again, I think when we make the link to cooperation with partner countries, the really interesting question is, where does migration come in? Do we have, I mean, as migration practitioners, we look at our migration files and, where does migration end and is limited, then we speak about mobility. But if we speak about economic recovery, for instance, as one of the major now, objectives for the short-term future, this year, end of this year, whenever possible. I mean, how does legal migration, how does talent, skills comes in there? And I think they are also to be very operational, and I think that's what we're discussing also in ICMPD. I mean, we don't always need an intervention, and an initiative where we have a big title about migration and mobility. No, it's a much broader agenda, but we have to find the intelligent way to place actually the role of, be they in the future called talent partnerships or cooperation on skills, upskilling, and so on. Make the link to the green economy, for instance. And the same also for digitalization, and especially I think when we look at the Eastern Partnership countries, where we have certainly great skills, great initiatives when it comes to digitalization of administration. As Jean-Louis said, I mean, the digitalization, it's there. The only question is, how do we steer it, and how do we use it? Which framework do we give it? And to go a step further, you asked about artificial intelligence. I wouldn't call myself an expert on artificial intelligence or digitalization, as some of my colleagues might know. But the topic is there. That is already, there's not a choice about, do we want, don't we want to do it? And I would like to refer to I found an excellent short article by the head of the EU agency for the large-scale IT systems, EU LISA, recently published, exactly about that, artificial intelligence, what to watch out for. And I'm quoting the head of the agency, or as it was written there: digital technologies are the engine for internal security. Data is the fuel. So we have ever more data. That is a fact. We will have ever more data with all the IT systems which will be put in place. We have the data. The question is how we use it, and and the ability to draw conclusions from that. And there, to deal with this wealth of data, artificial intelligence is certainly useful. But as Jean-Louis pointed out, it's absolutely crucial that it's in the end about evidence, so that decisions are taken. And decisions are about appreciation, and there personally, I do think we need still the human being to do that appreciation on the basis of data. So to my knowledge, there is work about artificial intelligence, and that is also pointed out. I really can only invite everyone to read that article. When it comes to ETIAS, for instance, about automatic screening of travelers on the basis of predefined risks. I think there are other major studies at the moment ongoing. So we will see it. We will see it. But there are certainly the framework, also data protection, of course. It has to be framed. And in the end, it's a tool. It's a tool, and to the use of ideally, as what we always call the evidence-based policy making.
Thank you, Ralph. Now, let's look a bit forward. Let's say we have some 20 minutes left before we then go into questions from the audience. So I would like to remind again everyone to send down some questions. The way we look at how the year started, it's clear that also 2021 will not be an ordinary year, if something like that ever existed, but especially not for migration nor for EU presidencies. And I would like to ask both of you, starting first maybe with Ralph, to see what are the main trends, what can be the impact of the clearly unequal economic recovery that will take place, but also with the unequal access to vaccination. Based on figures that we were able to gather recently, became clear that 16%, so countries representing 16% of the world population were able now to reserve 16% of all vaccines available. So this will have an impact on migration mobility. We touched upon it before already, Jean-Louis. But Ralph, where do you see the trends that we can look at? Is there any elements that we can already say? We should talk about scenarios. So which possible scenarios would you see, and what can we expect? Maybe also if you from Portugal as the presidency this year, as from the first half, where do you see elements that they could build up on, and what they should look out?
Thank you, Martijn. Very easy questions, but I think, I think as I said at the very beginning, first of all, we need the discussion, and I only in our migration world, I think it will continue to be a rich year when it comes to migration issues. And that's why I wanted to point out, there are various things which will be put on the table. Not the least, the whole Schengen discussion in the European Union. But then also, you refer to the Portuguese presidency. The Portuguese presidency, Portugal is a EU member state, which proactively put the issue of legal migration, of talent partnerships actually on its presidency agenda, which I think is noteworthy, and I would expect also from the Portuguese presidency, with their own experiences and practices and what and policies they have in place and needs on the national economy. That this discussion and emphasis also on legal migration is more part of the discussion than it was probably sometimes in the past. Now, I think what to watch out for, it is for me, it's the moment of when economic recovery and how to phrase it. How things will fit together at that moment. And I think there we have to be very careful and not to come to the easy conclusions. That is already in normal times. I think that's a point to be made when it comes to migration, and we speak about drivers and root causes and pull factors and so on. The easy solutions, the easy solutions and the easy conclusions. I don't believe in those. It's always a mix of factors, and I think already now when we speak about COVID and why certain countries, is it only related because the vaccinations here and there? I think very often in terms of drivers, we have the situation of this sort of a no future situation, which is in many countries of origin. That was already the case actually back in 2005. And you can see that, often actually when people want to leave their country. It's sort of it's a mix of various factors. I think within the European Union, I think the moment will be crucial when we will see economic recovery, when we will see that actually technological skills, the digitalization is moving. These skills are required, when we see that to fill gaps in this sector of the economies, we will need immigrants while we have certain degree of unemployment, and we will see, do we have a skills mismatch? So politicians will have to manage the situation that we might have. I mean, we will have unemployment higher than before. We will have certain needs on the labor market where actually it's seen that we need immigrants, and they're not, to come to conclusions which are, as I said, which are too easy, which leads to exclusion, to xenophobia, and so on. I think to manage that part of the economic recovery, where in the end everything comes together, I think is a very important one. And not to speak that the discussion on the pact and so on, I mean, all that we will see. But just one note about vaccination. I mean, at the moment, very focused on vaccination. This morning I read a longer article actually also about the medication, which is being, tested to see whether, we only speak at the moment about vaccination, but actually not about possible medication which could be found. So we come to the point that to make predictions exactly, I think that we have seen now over the last year, when and what and which time schedule and time plan we have when what happens. I think that is, I would be very careful with that.
Thank you, Ralph. Jean-Louis, I know that you will have something to say about the vaccination. You already mentioned that there is quite a lot of interest on your side in that regard. But I would also maybe ask you one question, referring back to your combined previous experiences, both as in DG ECHO and in DG Home. We see a number of migration crisis situations at the European borders, and Bosnia-Herzegovina being just the latest example. To what extent do you see that these crises are an effect of the present status of Europe's migration policies? And then, what would be your vision to address these? What would be something that we should try to look at in 2021? And secondly, of course, I would like to hear your opinion on what we need to watch, what kind of scenarios with regard to the impact of the unequal economic recovery, access to vaccination and medication, as Ralph rightly said. Your thoughts, please.
Yes, and all that in 5 minutes, of course, because you are now getting close. No, I was just looking for my crystal ball, but I did not manage to find it. Coming to your more precise question and then further elaborating on what Ralph very wisely said. This problem has been with us since, I would say, 20 years. That is to say, and it really relates to the notion of external border. I vividly remember, being an old timer, of the debates which were launched at the time by Germany and United Kingdom. At the time, the United Kingdom was still a member state of the European Union, about, okay, how should we handle our relation with the countries in the immediate neighborhood? And already there at the time was floating this idea, which reappeared very strangely during the deliberation of one European Council a couple of years ago, of this notion of platforms that would be either on the EU side of the border or on the non-EU side of the border, which transpired into the notion of hotspots, and which you can still see, but in a very vague way, behind the kind of border procedure that the Commission has proposed in the Pact tabled in September last year. So this problem is with us. And there is a close relationship, and there are a lot of similarities between what is happening in Bosnia today, what is happening in Moria or Lesbos, and what is still with us in Lesbos, what is happening in Libya. It's always the same situation, the same issue. Okay, when people are getting close to a border, the EU external border, where do we stop them? And by the way, it's exactly the same also in another area, which is a little bit lost, that we have been losing sight of, and it's Ceuta and Melilla. I mean, it's exactly, again, the same kind of geographical situation and geographical concern. So indeed, and you were right to make the connection with the humanitarian issue, what is happening, what we have seen these last days and these last years, I'm sorry, and I was involved in my last capacity of director of operations, humanitarian operation in ECHO, is that a non-managed migration situation becomes a humanitarian situation. And the EU is chipping in, and Bosnia is a perfect example, with humanitarian means, with humanitarian resources to cater for the consequences of what is fundamentally a failure of the EU immigration policy, same thing in Libya, for instance. Now, coming back to the big picture in a few words. In the first part of our conversation, I tried to explain how much of a crisis, in the very profound meaning of the word crisis, COVID-19 is today. One of the characteristics of this crisis, is that actually, and you can read thousands of papers about that, it has not created new problems or new trends. It has simply exacerbated existing problems or existing trends. I would refer, for instance, to the issue of inequalities. Ralph hinted at earlier during our conversation. And let's take the example, for instance, of, again, digitalization and teleworking. We are all teleworking. We are all participating into dozens of webinars, and we are still as unskilled in using the platforms which are offered to us. But it has an impact on the future of migration and labor migration. And I'm not disagreeing with what you said, Ralph. I'm just hinting at the fact that there are different scenarios. Let me take again an anecdote the veterans like me will remember. A couple, 10, 12 years ago, I mean, Germany was mouthful about attracting IT specialists. And there was this famous example of the 5,000 residence visa and work permit made available to Indian, IT specialists and IT specialists. A few weeks after the German government made this announcement, Lufthansa announced that it had delocalized its accounting service, guess where? In New Delhi. We might as well consider in the future that, yes, indeed, our workforce needs to be reinforced, but it can be reinforced at a distance. Or we take the ethical challenge to say very boldly that, yes, we need migrants for very physical jobs that cannot be implemented but on the spot, and jobs that our people do not want to take anymore. So, I mean, just as an example of these different scenarios that we can be leading to. Last, I could say other things all over. I would say relation with third countries. Two comments. First of all, and it relates directly to our audience, I mean, the countries, neighboring countries, part of the Prague process. We have to take into account the geopolitics of migration. We have to take into account the geopolitics of migration. And there, the relation with the vaccination issue is there. I mean, yes, indeed, there is a Chinese health diplomacy. They have done that with masks. They are doing that today with vaccine. What is our answer as EU? Yes, but okay, these Chinese vaccine, these Russian vaccine, the Sputnik vaccine, they have not been tested according to state-of-the-art methods. I mean, we are doubting about their efficiency and so on and so forth. Mind you, they are there. They are in Argentina. They are in Brazil. They are in Turkey. I mean, these countries do buy these vaccines, and they could not care less about whether they are more or less performing than the AstraZeneca or the Moderna vaccine of this world. This will create a new situation, and we have to take that into consideration. More in general, we have to get migration out of its migration box. We discussed that already, the three of us together. What I deeply regret when I read the pact, although there are a lot of very good ideas on that, is that it ended up being a paper draft or a series of paper drafted by migration freaks for migration freaks. I mean, all the issues that we've been discussed, I mean, the global issues which have an impact on migration and where migration should be firmly anchored into are not there. And that will transpire in the future of the relationship between the EU and third countries when dealing with migration. It is indeed highlighted as a priority by the German presidency in its legacy report. I have this text in front of me. Amongst the key elements of a comprehensive approach, the first one is on the external dimension. And I understand that it could be high on the agenda of the Portuguese presidency. But there, frankly, I would say, not even a political question. I have an ethical question. Are we really going to turn to a certain number of third countries, including members of the Prague process, because they are listed amongst the priorities in the German presidency paper? At the time, we are worldwide confronted with the vaccine situation that you mentioned and the figures that you gave, Martijn. Shall we be bold enough to go to this country and say, we really would like you to control better the migration and the irregular migration flows. And if you don't do that, by the way, we are going to suspend or make your life much more difficult when it is about getting visa. Mind you, at the time, people are not moving anymore. Are we really wanting to go to them and saying that to them at a time, I mean, they are struggling for a vaccine they don't get because we were the first one on the ball and because we have the big money? It's a question. Over to you.
Thank you. And a question that for sure we'll see a lot of discussion about in the coming weeks ahead. I mean, I know that also from our partners in Africa, there's a lot of issues raised, like, okay, the solidarity and kind of a Hunger Games approach towards the vaccination. Actually, the first question that we have from Lea Doctor is related to this, and it says that according to researchers, pandemics will be more likely partly due to climate change. So here's the link made to also the previous question. What did we learn? What are we learning? What can we learn from the current pandemic in terms of migration movements into the EU? With regard to refugees and borders and the widely used term of solidarity. Maybe you can, Mr. Ralph, and then Jean-Louis build upon this question and also maybe to what Jean-Louis already said. Ralph, please.
Yeah, we're trying, let's say, what have we learned? What we are trying to learn. I think still speaking about the EU, I mean, looking back, we have the European Union institutions, we have 27 EU the member states, the governments. So what we saw with a pandemic, we look first at our population, we look then cross-border, we look to find the European solutions, and then we look further. So pandemic is not immediately a global response. I think that is very clearly in the way. I mean, you know, still we are organized in the European Union, but across the globe. It's with the natural reaction, and Mayor cares first about the residents on his or her territory. Second point, I think it's about this exacerbating, not what Jean-Louis pointed out, of trends which are already out there. I think one notion we haven't yet mentioned or discussed is the sort of vulnerabilities of refugees and migrants, which we have seen in all the various situations, being excluded from provision of services, so access of services not possible. Very interestingly, even sort of, I mean, diaspora often seen as for countries as actually a lifeline, somehow not taken into account in what they could provide. Or by now, yes, but for the first response for a country, when we have migrants in, you know, moving along migratory routes, probably getting stuck somewhere, spending more time there, no access to actually to earn money, what the normal expectation would have been. So in general, vulnerability is certainly on the rise, then leading very often to humanitarian situation. I think then before again, sort of exacerbating already what are trends we have seen already.
Thank you, Jean-Louis, please.
Well, 2-3 comments. The first part of the question, yes, absolutely. There is evidence that there is a relation between, I would not say climate change as such, but the destruction of biodiversity and the multiplication of pandemics. I mean, nothing new under the sun. I mean, the SARS, the MERS were, the outcome of the same kind of transformation, where because of the destruction of biodiversity, ecosystem, which should not be in contact with each other, do enter into contact with each other, which facilitates the transmission of virus from one species to another. And I think that, well, again, I'm not an epidemiologist, but I tend to believe in or agree with those who say that, okay, we can expect a multiplication of pandemics of that kind in the future, maybe not as dramatic as the COVID-19, but again, it comes, it's not the first one. We've had, take also the avian flu, for instance, we've had these kind of stories or phenomenon already with us earlier. My second comment would be to insist on what you very rightly said, Ralph, about, okay, we don't have necessarily to look abroad, but we have to look also at those who are already here and there with us. We all heard about this very nicely worded English expression, herd immunity. Okay. Migrants, whether they are regular or irregular on our territories, are part of the local herds. So if we want to reach immunity, they have to be included in the provision of health services, including vaccination. And it will be difficult because for those who are in an irregular situation, it will be a bit complicated to convince them that they have to go to the vaccination center when it will be possible for them to get vaccinated and therefore get out of the kind of dark world they are into. But that must happen. And that is the reason why, for instance, I thought that the decision taken by the Portuguese government in the early days of the first lockdown phase to give immediately access to all the migrants, to health services, to all the migrants present on their territory was a very, very wise decision. Over to you.
Thank you very much. There's another question that came in via WhatsApp that I would like to address to Ralph. ICMPD as a secretariat, let's say, for various migration dialogues like Rabat, Khartoum, Budapest, and of course, in present setting, the Prague process. What role do you see for these as intercontinental dialogues, which bring countries, from different regions together to look at, future migration patterns and also maybe the question of solidarity that we just discussed. Please.
Well, I personally, I'm not going. I'm speaking also on behalf of ICMPD, and it's clear that in ICMPD, but also personally, I've sort of grown up as a migration practitioner with bilateral, but especially multilateral migration dialogues. Now, I firmly believe that dialogue, or you can call it migration diplomacy or external dimension, but the need to that countries talk to each other in order, and I do like the term migration realities, to create a common understanding of the realities is absolutely necessary, especially when we have massive change and so on. It opens channels for communication. It's sort of, we call it a laboratory for things to be then explored and funded through much bigger programs. I mean, often we have a discussion, whether it's worth having these dialogues over years and years, many people sitting together or now around the screen, but it's still the sharing of practices. We spoke before about practices, and not only to stay at the surface and say, oh, everything is not functioning, everything is bad, and so on. I mean, can be developed there. The context can be established. Now, I do think that after all the years of dialogues in the different regions, but it's also very region specific. There must always be the attempt to move a step beyond. And I think we have, over the past 2 years or so, I mean, often we spoke in the EU, or we speak about the migratory route approach. Now, I think that is something in the future we should work still more on. and to really see what the countries along a migration route actually not only can talk together, but can do together. I think often we see EU working with countries of transit, EU working with countries of origin, but not necessarily the trilateral cooperation or the facilitation of countries of transit working with countries of origin. And by the way, just a parenthesis, I find personally a term which is totally lacking in the EU Pact when it comes to the external dimension. I think that I'm not wrong to say that actually the external dimension only speaks about countries of transit and origin. I think that's wrong. I mean, it must be countries of origin, transit, and destination. And the EU has to talk to countries of destination in the global south, in the Eastern Partnership countries. So it's not only about transit and origin, it's also, we have many transit countries being at the same time destination countries. But to try to move a step along, to see more actually what to do, if you know, try that in the countries along a route to do it together.
Thank you, Ralph. Jean-Louis, there's a question from Kalkidan Bezabi, who asks, what measures or strategies do you think should be taken into consideration to address the causes for migration, the reasons for fleeing their country of origin? Pandemic, of course, might play a role in future playing, but in general, where do you see this question, which often comes back, how we should look at the root causes? You know, again, with your background, where do you think should be, which strategies should be taken into consideration?
Again, I mean, a very fundamental question. To be a bit blunt, I think that we should once and for all get rid of the notion of root causes of migration. I mean, it's leading to misunderstanding and bad political decision. I mean, but again, I mean, I was part of these misunderstanding at the time. People were mouthful about, oh yes, but we have to deal with the root causes of migration. Okay, dealing with the root causes of migration will take ages. It will take generation. It is about global economic balance. And we are not there yet, and we'll never be there yet. At the same time, when migration was on the top of the agenda, which is not the case anymore, people were asking to migration response here and now. So I think that this should now basically get out of our language. My deeply rooted conviction is that, I mean, yes, indeed, it is about partnership, and we've discussed that, and indeed, I mean, ICMPD has a role to play in promoting partnership, but that these partnerships cannot be limited to migration-related issues. It includes the broad agenda. I mean, it includes trade, it includes investment, and it includes also, I would say, improvement of governance, good governance, that we should bear in mind. I have always extremely lively discussion with some of my American friends and colleagues who are insisting on the fact that, I mean, the main driver of migration at the end of the day is not that much economic inequalities, but there are governance related issues in countries where you have a young, healthy, educated population, which is confronted with corruption, with bad governance, with, disrespect for fundamental freedoms, with confiscation of the national wealth by a clique or an elite. I mean, so all that has to be factored into broadly formulated partnership. I'm interested to see, for instance, how the EU will implement. I know that it's not related to the Prague Process member, but the EU will implement its very ambitious agenda for an African Union, European Union partnership. I mean, this is the blueprint of the way we should go to. That is to say, addressing a global set of issues, understanding what the views are of those who pretend we are our partner, and then, amongst others, include migration, if it is relevant, amongst these issues, but as part and parcel of a much broader agenda. So a partnership, yes, partner, not aiming at doing something impossible, that is to say, addressing the root causes, but I mean, horizontal one with, if needed and if necessary, a dedicated chapter or section to migration-related issue. And I'm afraid that it's not exactly the way the EU is engaging into. Over to you.
Thank you. I have a number of questions came in, Jean-Louis, Ralph. There's one question which looks basically, and what happens? So basically, due to the border closures of COVID-19, the influx of migrants to the EU went down. That is clear, although not everywhere the same way. The question is, will there now be an influx once the travel restrictions are lifted? And what can be done to this potential influx? And linked to that, also a question which came from Robert Verbitsky from the European Commission, who says that the World Health Organization says that only global vaccination will have an impact on the pandemic. So we will not be safe until globally enough people are vaccinated. And the question here is, do you think it would have an impact on migration in Europe? And will Europe be closed for migration from non-sufficiently vaccinated regions, leaving those in protection need in peril? So basically the question is, what happens when the borders open? How will they open? Ralph, please, maybe from your side, what could we expect first, and maybe to Jean-Louis afterwards?
Well, I think we started the conversation where we both said, actually, forecasting. I think we are a little bit hesitant about that. It's about scenarios. I did like, the notion, Jean-Louis, you mentioned at the beginning, it's sort of mobility bubbles. I mean, and I think that will be, I can see as a scenario. And yes, I mean, any country will adapt and have to adapt after. I mean, we see that already now. Whenever there's a possibility to open up, it will be opened up. If we then see sort of, I don't know, migration, I mean, bubbles or migration corridors, or because there is something which is seen to be safe, and I think there will be ever more sophisticated sort of indicators for when something is seen as safe, or the possibility for opening up. So we will be. I think they're not the one. I mean, a bit of a patchwork of corridors, bubbles, which we might see emerging. I think the general trend, yes, absolutely. As we closed borders, so all figures went down basically. So we will. I'm convinced we will see an increase in both legal and irregular migration. I mean, when exactly? I think that depends a lot on many factors. We spoke about for me, the key moment is really when we see, the various factors which will influence economic recovery. But also there, to make a linear conclusion, one thing happens, that's why we see immediately these and these flows. I think there are always various variables which influence the decision, or which information is then also given through digital means and so on. So I think there are various variables to determine sort of which flows we will see in general. And if we stay at the more EU broader level, yes, we will see, I think, an increase in flows. But I think these various variables which influence, I think it's important. It's also linked to, Jean-Louis spoke about before about the root causes, or drivers. I think it's a much better notion. And I said before, and in many countries where we will see a delayed economic recovery, we will have this situation of this feeling of a no future. It's linked to governance, as Jean-Louis said, linked to economy, about unbalances, inequalities, and so on. And that then influences very strongly, motivates to seek a better life somewhere else.
Thank you. Jean-Louis, I'll give the floor to you. Because I would like to enrich this. There's actually a debate going on, where say, okay, in order to migrate, of course, everyone needs a minimum number of resources, access to resources. And of course, in many of the countries we talk about that access to resources is less available. We see actually that in, UNHCR says, we had a conversation recently, hinted that, well, maybe the real impact on more migration will not be maybe in 2021, but in 2022. So from a scenario perspective, there's different considerations. Again, we talk about scenarios, not about predicting the future, because that's not possible. Jean-Louis, please.
Yes, a few comments on that. On the questions of Robert Ribicki, and I give him my regards. It's an old friend and colleague. Yes, absolutely. That will happen, and the mobility bubbles that we were both referring to, Ralph and myself, are ahead of us. Look at what the island countries are going to do. Look at the decision taken by New Zealand. Look at what's going to happen in Australia. Australia is developing what they call the biosafe border. What is going to be the future policy of the United Kingdom? Just as an example. We really have to watch very carefully what's going to happen. And indeed, we might end up in that situation where travel facilities are restricted between different regions of the world, according to, the health indicator in the said region. Will the reopening of the border lead to more migrants coming into Europe? I'm a little bit intrigued by this question. To my understanding, the irregular migrants are not waiting for regular airlines to fly to arrive in Europe. In other words, I think that the reinvigorating of irregular migration flows will depend on many factors, including indeed the last one that you mentioned, Martijn. That is to say that also because of the drying up of transfers from diasporas to countries of origin, the economic situation in some countries will deteriorate such that people will have no other possibility than to look for somewhere else, just for their not even their well-being, but their survival. But there, I would say, and again, it's about scenarios. We have to factor into, in the business model of the smugglers. You are absolutely right. Smugglers do business with a commodity called irregular migrant if they are paid for that. And if the would-be irregular migrant are not able to afford the cost of being smuggled, that could indeed disrupt the business of the smugglers. There was also one question, if you allow me, Martijn, in the chat box, which immediately relates to the situation of many countries in the Prague process. That is to say, the possible, social unrest, let alone political troubles in a series of EU neighboring countries. The example of Belarus is quoted. We saw what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh, for instance, and so on and so forth. There, I would say, experience made me to be a little bit more prudent in terms of forecast. And I here refer to the way we saw the situation unfolding in Ukraine. In the first time of the crisis, there was Maidan, and then there was the Crimea annexation, and then the violence broke up in Donbass. I was working in very close coordination with HCR at the time, and we made a series of forecasts about possible mass inflows of Ukrainians to the Polish border, fleeing violence through the Polish border into the EU. That did not materialize. First, because Ukrainians, most of the displaced person remained internally displaced person. There was 1 million moving from the east to the western part of the country. Yes, indeed, that's what I meant. And of course, we all know that, there are nowadays 2 million Ukrainians in Poland, indeed, but they are there as a regular or semi-regular migrants, and they are contributing to, the renewed prosperity of Poland. So yes, indeed, we have to watch it. We have to have what the French call une fonction de veille, but I would not bet as of today that these geopolitical threats would materialize overnight in supplementary or new migration flow towards the EU. Over to you.
Thank you very much. There's still quite a lot of questions in the chat, but we have 3 minutes left, and I would actually like to use those 3 minutes. Well, you can look at some of the questions which have not been answered. Some of them address directly the labor migration situation and the access to labor, for example, could be addressed. But maybe I would like to give both of you the opportunity to add maybe a few words, for your closing words from your side, which you would like to take out of this discussion, or what was underemphasized. So Ralph, from your side, if you see now what you have seen, maybe also from the different questions which came, maybe not necessarily a solution, but like, okay, clearly we need to look deeper into this aspect following the conversation that we had today. Ralph.
Well, I think one topic, it's a broad topic of how do we as migration analysts, practitioners, operational people, I don't know, those involved in policy and administrations, we deal and look, at migration. I think it's just what we discussed showed so much that we have to put it in the broader context. We haven't even spoken about, diplomatic relations, about, what's the objective when we want to, or when the EU wants to cooperate with a country. If it's, to ensure stability of a country, because there are certain circumstances, then migration has also to fit and contribute to that. So, but I think here, what is so striking again, for me, it's the economic recovery in I'm based in Belgium, in the EU member states, the neighborhood. Here we speak about the Prague process, but also Central Asia and around the globe, the economic recovery, and there to make the use of the trends and the facts in the end. And that is also about legal migration, about skills, about talent, and to have there probably a more nuanced approach with new initiatives which are now on the table, which can be discussed, and where initiative, and there was one question to it, do we see there a momentum for it? I think with the Portuguese presidency, there is a momentum. I think it is actually interesting when you look throughout, I would even say all EU member states, and legal labor migration is a fact. There might be discrepancy between political discourse and fact sometimes. But there are certainly trends because the needs are there on the labor market. But so the key moment for me is it's the economic recovery and how actually their migration and migration trends can contribute to it without leaving migrants with whatever status behind.
Thank you very much, Ralph. Jean-Louis, that you would like to add?
Okay, listening to Ralph, I was thinking it's the economy stupid, but indeed you're absolutely right. No, we actually left very few stone unturned during this 1 hour and a half debate, but this just increased what I see, my regret and about what I see as a missed opportunity by the EU. Let me explain what I mean. The label New Pact on Migration. We could have expected something more ambitious. And you might also remember, it seems to be ages ago, that migration fell under a portfolio of a vice president of the Commission in charge, and I know that there were a lot of criticism about that, of the so-called promotion of the EU way of life. So, by putting forward a groundbreaking climate change agenda, by putting forward a state-of-the-art digitalisation agenda, the EU, and in particular the von der Leyen Commission, has demonstrated its capacity to, play a role of leadership on a certain number of global issues. It has missed this opportunity with regard to the Pact. I can understand why. And again, I come back to what I said earlier. I have a lot of understanding for the difficult role of the Commission. People most probably thought that it was very difficult to come with a world global vision of the future of migration at a time the EU was still living with Moria and fires in the camp of Moria on its territory, which happened a couple of weeks before, even 1 week or two before the Pact was tabled. So I can understand all that. But we would have needed a little bit of, like Greta Thunberg said about climate change, a little bit of more cathedral thinking about when presenting this blueprint for my EU migration policy. That's a little bit what we tried to do during this conversation, that to say, to show the links between migration and, or let's put it all away, how migration plays into these big world games, which are climate change, which are moving to a digital agenda, safeguarding democracy, safeguarding multilateralism, I mean, the geopolitics of the world. This was not there. There might still be a space to do so. Maybe we need more actions than talks, but at least we should make sure that this action, and that's also a word that I found in the German presidency report, is future-proof. I'm not so sure that what the Commission has proposed, with all due respect, is actually leading to a future-proof approach.
I would like to thank Ralph, Jean-Louis for their very active and very insightful participation. I would like to thank the Prague Process team, which has made this possible, and all attendees. We had at some point more than 130, 140 attendees for their staying with us the last 1.5 hours. Thank you very much, and looking forward to see you at the next event. Thank you.
Thank you.